Picture this moment with me. It's a crisp February morning in 1984, and you're awakened not by an alarm clock, but by the familiar scrape of the snowplow grinding down your suburban street. You pad to the window in your flannel pajamas and pull back those heavy curtains to reveal a world transformed overnight. 2 feet of pristine snow has blanketed everything in sight. The silence is profound, almost sacred. Your breath creates small clouds against the cold glass as you take in this winter wonderland that stretches as far as you can see. Downstairs, the familiar sounds of morning are already underway. The coffee maker gurgles to life, filling the kitchen with that rich aroma that means home. Your mother moves quietly around the kitchen, the radio tuned to the local morning show where familiar voices provide the soundtrack to another Canadian day. Outside, the thermometer reads -23 Celsius, but inside this cocoon of warmth and routine, everything feels exactly as it should be. This was life in 1980s Canada, a decade that sits like a bridge between the simpler past and our complicated present. If you lived through these years, you understand immediately what made them special. There was a rhythm to daily life, a predictable comfort that came from shared experiences and unspoken agreements about how the world worked. Technology was creeping in, money was tighter than the decades before, and yet, somehow, the world still felt mostly safe and hopeful. Saturday mornings held their own sacred ritual. You would wake early, not because anyone forced you, but because missing your favorite cartoons simply wasn't an option. Inspector Gadget, The Raccoons, He-Man, Transformers, the shows were appointment television long before that phrase existed. You'd pour yourself a generous bowl of Sugar Crisp or Lucky Charms, cereal so loaded with sugar they'd be considered health hazards today, and plant yourself cross-legged on the living room carpet just 2 feet from the television screen. The television itself might still be a chunky console with fake wood paneling, but by the mid-80s, it almost certainly had a remote control, even if half the buttons didn't quite work. Cable TV had arrived in most cities and suburbs, and suddenly there were more channels than you could keep track of. When the picture got fuzzy, someone still had to get up and adjust those rabbit ear antennas while the rest of the family shouted directions from the couch. Better, worse, a little to the left, hold it right there. There was no streaming, no pausing, no watch it later. You watched what was on when it was on, and somehow that limitation made television feel more precious, more communal. A neighbor still remembers racing home from a friend's house every afternoon because the Littlest Hobo started at 4:30 sharp, and missing even the opening notes of that haunting theme song felt like a genuine tragedy. Another remembers that feeling on Sunday night when The Wonderful World of Disney came on, that weekly movie that told you the weekend was ending but still gave you one last piece of magic before school on Monday. These little rituals stitched the week together in ways that still echo in memory. But if Saturday morning cartoons were important, Saturday night was sacred. Hockey Night in Canada wasn't just a television program, it was a national ritual that united the entire country. Whether you lived in Vancouver or Halifax, St. John's or Yellowknife, at 8 o'clock, every television in every home turned to the same channel. Your father would settle into his favorite chair. Your mother might fold laundry on the couch or knit what would eventually become someone's Christmas sweater. And your brothers would sprawl on the floor, arguing about whether the Oilers or the Canadians were superior, which really meant debating whether Wayne Gretzky was the greatest hockey player who ever lived. Between periods, someone would make popcorn. Maybe by the late 80s, it came from a microwave bag. But many families still did it the old-fashioned way, standing at the stove, shaking a heavy pot back and forth over the burner, listening for the pops to slow down, trying not to let it burn. the smell would fill the entire house. That perfect combination of butter and salt with just a hint of that slightly burnt edge that meant you'd waited 10 seconds too long. This wasn't background noise you half watched while scrolling your phone. This was an event. Here's something that might sound impossible to younger generations. During the game, entire neighborhoods would fall quiet. Every single house was tuned to the same broadcast. You could walk outside during the second period and hear the announcers' voices echoing from living room to living room down the street. When Canada scored, you'd hear spontaneous cheers erupt from every direction at once, as if the whole neighborhood was one giant family room celebrating together. After the game ended, something magical would happen. Despite the late hour and the freezing temperature, kids would bundle up and pour onto the street for impromptu games of road hockey under the streetlights. Tennis balls replaced pucks because pucks would slide too far on the ice and snow. Someone's garage door became the net, and someone's father was always eventually yelling from a window to keep the noise down. Nobody wanted to play goalie because it meant getting pelted with frozen tennis balls while wearing your winter coat as the only padding. Earlier in the day, long Saturday afternoons defined childhood freedom in the 80s. After breakfast and cartoons, your mother might hand you a couple of dollars or just a stern reminder about your chores and send you outside with a simple instruction: go play. This wasn't go play for 30 minutes and then come back. There were no scheduled play dates, no group chats, no constant check-ins. This was leave after lunch and don't come home until dinner. The only real rule was to be back when the streetlights came on. If you were lucky enough to live near a corner store, that change in your pocket meant something. You'd walk there with your friends, boots crunching on snow, or sneakers slapping hot pavement, and the bell above the door would announce your arrival with a cheerful jingle. You'd stand transfixed in front of the candy counter, faced with the most important financial decision of your week. Maybe penny candy still existed in small town shops, maybe not, but you could definitely walk out with a little paper bag of treats and still have a coin or two left. The person behind the counter knew your family, knew your parents' names, knew if you were the kind of kid who could be trusted to run an errand without pocketing the change. These weren't just transactions, they were small acts of community. The owner would ask how school was going, warn you about the ice on the sidewalks, tell you they saw your mom at the store yesterday. When you left, that bell would jingle again as you step back into the cold or heat, clutching your paper bag like it contained genuine treasure. Then came the real adventure. You and your neighborhood friends would meet up at the park or the Ravine or that empty lot 3 blocks over. In winter, you'd spend hours building snow forts that felt like genuine fortresses. The older kids often had massive constructions that had been under development for weeks, with walls 4 feet high and tunnels you could crawl through. If you showed up ready to work and weren't being annoying, you were welcome regardless of your age. One local resident still remembers taking his sled to the ravine near his neighborhood. He and his friends would hike all the way to the top, which seemed to take forever when you were 8 years old. Then fly down the steep, winding paths that were barely wide enough for the sled. Sometimes you'd wipe out spectacularly, sometimes you'd hit a tree. His friend broke his wrist doing exactly this once, but the very next weekend, everyone was back because that's simply what you did. You fell, you got up, you tried again. Even as the decade went on, and news stories about kidnappings and stranger danger started appearing more often, especially in bigger cities, there were still countless neighborhoods where kids roamed freely from morning until the last light faded. There were rough edges, there were risks, But there was also a kind of freedom that's hard to explain to anyone who grew up with GPS trackers in their pockets. And then there was school, not just as a place you went because you had to, but as the social center of your teenage universe. A school day in 1980s Canada began with the sound of locker doors slamming and boots squeaking on linoleum. Hallways smelled like wet wool mittens, floor cleaner, and paper. You'd walk in wearing a parka and end up stuffing it into a locker already overflowing with textbooks, gym clothes, and that one crumpled note you never had the heart to throw away. Inside those lockers were bits of your private world, band logos carefully cut out from magazines, photos from the mall photo booth, maybe a scribbled "Rush" or "The Police" on the inside of the door. If you were lucky, you had a Walkman. It was more than just a gadget, it was a lifeline. You'd tuck it into your jacket pocket, run the wire up your sleeve, and hope the teacher wouldn't notice when you quietly pressed play between classes. The foam headphones leaked just enough sound that your friends could recognize the song and nod along. You swapped tapes in the hallway, copied albums, carefully curated mixtapes, half illegal dubs of songs taped off the radio during the Sunday night countdown. Classes were mostly chalkboards and overhead projectors, the squeak of chalk, and the warm hum of machines that occasionally melted plastic transparencies. You took notes by hand in spiral-bound notebooks. If you wanted to send a message, you folded a piece of paper into a small, intricate triangle and passed it along a chain of friends who knew exactly when to look, exactly when to pretend they were reaching for a pencil. There was no group chat, no email, just the thrill of a handwritten note that might contain a joke, a secret, or an invitation to the school dance. At least once a year, everyone would gather for something that felt bigger than the school itself. The Terry Fox Run. You'd stand in the gym while teachers reminded you why you were running, what it meant, who Terry was, and what he had tried to do. Then the whole school would file out. Kids in mismatched gym clothes, teachers in windbreakers, parents sometimes lining the route, and you'd jog or walk through the neighborhood, coins rattling in pledge envelopes. You might not have understood the full weight of it then, but you knew it mattered. You knew this was Canadian in a way that stuck with you. After school, life shifted into another gear. Maybe you walked home, backpack slung over one shoulder, stopping at the arcade in the strip mall where the glow of screens lit up dark corners, and quarters disappeared into machines that promised high scores and bragging rights. Maybe you headed for the food court in the big mall, meeting friends under a clock or by a fountain everyone used as a landmark. Arcades, pizza shops, movie theaters, they were the places where your social life unfolded, one game, one slice, one ticket stub at a time. And then there were school dances, those awkward electric nights in the gym where colored lights bounced off glossy floors, and the DJ inevitably played Bryan Adams, Rush, and whatever slow ballad was currently breaking hearts. You remember? The courage it took to cross that vast empty space between groups of friends, the way your heart pounded when your crush said yes to a slow dance, the smell of hairspray in the air, because this was the decade of big hair hold-in-place by products that could probably withstand a hurricane. All of this happened in a world that still felt relatively low-tech. The center of your home communication system was that avocado green or harvest gold telephone hanging on the kitchen wall, its spiraling cord stretched so long it could reach into the dining room. If you wanted to talk to your friends, you called them. If the line was busy, you hung up and tried again 10 minutes later. There were rules about when the phone could ring, not during dinner, not after 9, unless it was an emergency. If it did ring late, adults in the house would look at each other with a little knot of worry in their stomachs. Here's the beautiful part of that system. If you wanted to talk to your friend and their line was perpetually busy, you simply walked to their house. You'd knock on the front door, their mother would answer, and yell upstairs something like, "Jenny, your friend is here." And Jenny would come running down in her socks. You'd end up hanging out in the basement watching music videos on MuchMusic until dinner time. MuchMusic was everything to Canadian teenagers when it launched in 1984. Suddenly, there was a channel that spoke your language, played your bands, reflected your world. VJs became minor celebrities, and videos were events. You'd wait all week to see the premiere of a new Corey Hart or Glass Tiger song. You'd watch Bryan Adams, Rush, Platinum Blonde, and The Tragically Hip, along with British and American acts that defined the era. On Friday nights, music shows and late-night movie slots gave you something to talk about on Monday that everyone had seen together. This was how culture spread in those days, not through algorithms or social media trends, but through millions of people watching the same show at the same time, and then dissecting it in hallways, locker rooms, and cafeterias. Music wasn't something you consume quietly on personalized playlist. It was inherently social. If someone owned a boombox and everyone desperately wanted one despite the price, you'd bring it to the park, and people would gather around it like a portable campfire. Getting music required effort and intention. There were no downloads, no streaming services. If you wanted to own a song, you walked into Sam the Record Man or another record store and flipped through rows of vinyl or cassettes. Albums cost real money, and a part-time job at Dairy Queen or Woolco might be your primary funding source. You became an expert at making mixtapes, pressing record at exactly the right moment when your favorite song came on the radio, cursing quietly when the DJ talked over the intro. Food in the 80s occupied its own distinct universe. Your mother shopped at Dominion or Loblaws or Safeway or Co-op, pushing a metal shopping cart with at least one squeaky wheel that announced her presence throughout the store. In some provinces, milk came in those peculiar plastic bags that you'd place in a pitcher before snipping the corner off. Americans find this practice hilarious, but if you grew up in Ontario or Quebec, this was simply how milk worked. Earlier decades had seen milkmen on most streets. By the 80s, they were already disappearing, but in some neighborhoods, you still woke to the clink of glass bottles on porch steps, a fading echo of an older rhythm. Bread came from the bakery section, meat from the butcher counter, where someone in a white apron would wrap your selection in crisp paper and write the price with a grease pencil. Everything felt more personal, more connected to actual human beings. Tim Hortons was still mostly about coffee, donuts, and cigarette smoke curling toward yellowed ceilings. You'd stop there on road trips, your father ordering coffee while you chose between a dachi and a honey cruller, watching donuts flip in hot oil through a fogged-up window. Dinner was almost always prepared at home. Your mother made pot roast that had been cooking slowly all afternoon, shepherd's pie with real mashed potatoes, cabbage rolls, spaghetti with jarred sauce, chicken that emerged golden from the oven, fish sticks with frozen peas on Fridays. Eating out was a treat reserved for special occasions. Swiss Chalet, a Red Lobster, or your local family restaurant meant someone had been promoted, a birthday was being celebrated, or relatives were visiting from out of town. Fast food existed, of course. McDonald's, Burger King, Harvey's, A&W drive-ins with frosted mugs, but a meal there still felt like something worth talking about, not just a default solution after a long day. Family road trips were adventures that required real commitment. Your family might drive a Pontiac Parisian, a Chevrolet Caprice, a Ford LTD, or that famous Plymouth Reliant K-car. These were enormous vehicles with bench seats and no airbags. Cars where kids sprawled in the back without car seats or screens, watching the world go by through big square windows. In winter, your father would go outside before sunrise to start the car and let it warm up, breath hanging in the air while the engine coughed awake. In summer, windows were rolled down and warm air carried the smell of cut grass, asphalt, and distant barbecues. You drive to cottage country in Ontario, or to the Rockies out west, or all the way to New Brunswick or Nova Scotia to visit relatives. The dashboard held paper maps, not GPS screens. Arguments broke out over wrong turns, and everyone in the back seat knew the particular tone of voice their father used when he insisted he didn't need to stop and ask for directions. Time in the car stretched differently then. Half an hour felt like 3 hours, but the memory that remains is the sense of journey, of watching gas stations and motels and small towns pass by, feeling like the country went on forever. Expo 86 defined an entire year and showed something important about Canadian identity in that decade. If you were Canadian in 1986, Expo wasn't just an event in Vancouver, it was a symbol that the country had stepped confidently into the future. People traveled from across the provinces to line up for pavilions, ride the SkyTrain past Canada Place and its white sails, and stare wide-eyed at technology that seemed impossibly advanced. For kids who walked through those gates, the world felt big and full of possibility. For parents who had lived through earlier, leaner times, there was pride in seeing Canada host the world. Underneath all of this daily detail sat the broader reality of the 1980s economy. It wasn't as uniformly easy as the boom years of the 60s. The early part of the decade brought a painful recession that hit many communities hard. Interest rates soared into the mid-teens and beyond. Families who had taken out mortgages at the wrong moment found themselves struggling. Factories in some towns closed and never reopened. Free trade debates and global shifts in manufacturing were already reshaping the working world in ways that would become much more obvious later. And yet, for many Canadians, there was still a sense that hard work could build a decent life. A single income job at CN Rail, the post office, a mill, a bank, a factory, or the public service could still support a family in a modest house with a backyard. University tuition, while not cheap, remained something a determined student could realistically cover with summer jobs and part-time work. People married younger. Many expected to stay with the same employer for decades and retire with a pension. There was anxiety, but there was also optimism. What people who lived through the 80s miss most isn't just the price of houses or the cost of a chocolate bar. They miss the texture of community life, the way people treated each other at hockey rinks and in grocery store lines, the way neighbors watched out for each other's kids and shoveled each other's driveways without keeping score, the way you could knock on a door and be invited in for coffee without anyone checking their calendar first. People were present in ways that seem remarkable now. When you spoke with someone, they looked directly at you and listened. Conversations happened without constant interruptions from electronic devices. Meals took place around tables rather than in front of screens. Children played without anyone documenting every moment. Life unfolded without the pressure to record, post, or perform it. Of course, the decade wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. The Cold War hung over everything in the background, sometimes flaring into fear when movies like The Day After appeared on TV or when teachers mentioned nuclear drills from earlier decades. The ozone layer and acid rain became real worries. Not everyone experienced the 80s as carefree, and not every community felt safe or welcoming. Inequality, discrimination, and injustice still existed, even if they were talked about less openly. But underneath all the complexity, there was a foundation of shared experience and social trust that held much of society together. When people say they miss the 80s, they're not just missing cassette tapes, video arcades, or Saturday morning cartoons, they're missing the feeling that life made a kind of fundamental sense, that you knew your place in your neighborhood and your neighborhood knew you, that the future, while uncertain, felt mostly like something to look forward to. The 1980s in Canada weren't simply a decade marked on calendars. They were a chapter of life when existence felt manageable, when neighbors often felt like extended family, when being bored meant inventing games or building something instead of scrolling endlessly through feeds. It was an era when being disconnected from electronics meant being truly free, when going outside was the default, not an accomplishment. Those years are gone, and the world has changed in ways nobody in that snowy February of 1984 could have imagined. But the memories remain, vivid and powerful. They live in the smell of percolated coffee, the sound of skates carving into outdoor ice, the feel of a Walkman in your pocket, the glow of an arcade in a dark corner of the mall, the ache in your legs after riding your bike all day. So as we close this visit to 1980s Canada, let me ask you something. What's the one memory from growing up in that decade you'll never forget? Maybe it's a school dance, a Terry Fox run, a Saturday morning cartoon, the first time you heard your favorite song on MuchMusic, or a winter road hockey game under the streetlights. Share it in the comments below. These stories matter. They remind us not just of where we've been, but of who we were when life moved at a different rhythm and community felt like something you could touch, hear, and trust completely.